Hey everybody, I just wanted to take a couple minutes and talk to you about the 11.3, 11.4, and 11.6 thing that we've all been talking about. So somebody recently came up with the theory that it had to do with, I guess it would be Article 11 or Chapter 11 of this particular set of rules, the Department of Defense Law or of War Manual. Now you can find this online. As you can see, it's large, 1,204 pages. So this is the PDF version of it that you can download. I believe it's on the DoD website. It happens to be locked, so you can't do any kind of editing to it, like highlighting. The highlighting feature doesn't work on here. So what I had to do was I printed out a few pages of it so that I could edit them and put some little highlighted areas in there, and only showed the relevant part. Plus the smaller version's a lot easier to scroll through. A file this size it takes a while to scroll. It gets a little laggy. And I'm using a pretty powerful computer. Anyways, so I wanted to start out with this. This, if you get that full, this version will be page 21, I believe, although at the bottom of it, it just has these X's. But there's a table of abbreviations, and there's a certain abbreviation that appears in Article 11 several times. And, something that drives me crazy when I'm watching videos like this is somebody will say, well, this abbreviation means such and such, and they give absolutely no reason why you should believe that they're right. Well, I just wanted to show you. Here it is. GC stands for Geneva Convention. If you Google, GC military terms, you're going to find like a big old list. There's like General Counsel and all sorts of other things. Anyway, for the purpose of this document, GC stands for Geneva Convention. Okay, before we get to it, just some things that I've seen in some conversations online, people talking about this document, is using the term belligerent occupation. I have not been able to find any evidence that would cause me to believe that there's a difference between belligerent occupation and just occupation. I believe that they're basically one and the same, and that just belligerent is used to describe the nature of the occupation, and it's basically based on the idea that occupation implies hostility, right? So when one nation occupies another nation, it's implied that that is a hostile situation, and that's why they use the word belligerent. The real distinction that we really need to make here is actually the difference between occupation and sovereignty. So there are rules in place for nations occupying other nations, and there's a different set of rules for a nation actually totally overthrowing another nation and then exercising sovereignty and basically declaring that nation as being their own territory. And so for the sake of this document, most of what we're dealing with is the rules of occupation, not the rules of sovereignty. The context is that we're talking about here, obviously we've got all these Q posts, that mention 11.3, 11.4, and 11.6. What I've discovered in reading this document is that those particular chapters make a whole lot more sense if you understand 11.2, 11.7, and 11.8. They kind of establish the foundation or the context of 11.3, 4, and 6. So briefly before I get into it, I want to talk about what exactly is occupation. So what came to my mind when I first started studying this was we occupied Iraq. So the way that we did that, we invaded and we took over, and as far as I'm aware, we obeyed the rules of occupation. We may not have, but I think we did. And so what we did not do was we did not go in there and basically steal Iraq. We didn't go in there and say, hey, guess what? We're your government now. Guess what? We own all of your oil now. We didn't do that. We did replace their government, which, as you'll see if you read this document, that is within the permissions granted to an occupying force. But we just occupied. We did not exercise sovereignty over them. That is evidenced by the fact that they have their own government. We didn't actually steal their oil, and so on. Okay, so first off, we're going to talk about 11.2. So what 11.2 does is define when an occupation has actually taken place. So I'm going to read some of these highlighted areas and comment on them. And again, like, this is my opinion. I'm not an attorney. I'm not licensed to practice law. I'm just some stupid guy from Texas who has an opinion. And, you know, I think, for one, if you really need a legal opinion on this stuff, you should hire an attorney. And for two, you ought to think for yourself. For all you know, I'm intentionally trying to deceive you. I recommend just reading this whole thing and think about all the stuff that it says and, you know, judge for yourself what you think it means. But I think I'm going to be able to point you in a direction that that could be pretty enlightening. Okay, so the law of military occupation applies when a military occupation exists in fact. Okay, and what that really means is that the fact of occupation is the basis for the occupying power to exercise authority over the occupied territory. Which basically what that means is, in order for an occupation to be legal or complete, for it to actually exist in the status of occupied, the occupier has to have effectively taken power to exercise authority over that territory, right? Okay. Now, there's you might think about what does that look like for a nation to actually do that, to actually get the power to exercise authority over occupied territory. You might think they'd have to have military boots on the ground and all these other things. But as we keep on looking through this document, what we find is that territory is considered occupied when it's actually placed under the authority of hostile forces. It's the authority that's the defining factor, not the forces. It's just the fact that they can exercise authority over the territory. Now keep reading down here. Military occupation does not require the presence of military forces. So that means they don't actually have to have like military boots on the ground in order to effectively occupy another nation. Additionally, the types of forces used, it's irrelevant. It doesn't matter if it's soldiers, if it's politicians, it doesn't matter if it's business owners, whatever. The fact is, the force, the ability to exercise authority is what defines the nature of the occupation, not the type of force used, okay? Now, check this out. There's no precise number of forces that are considered necessary to constitute an effective occupation, which basically means it could be a really small number, it could be a really big number. It's basically irrelevant, okay? Now, here's part that's going to be kind of shocking. Check this out. Not that part. The substitution of authority by the occupying power may be shown by a proclamation of occupation, although such a proclamation is not required. Okay, some big words there. Let me translate into simplified English. They can occupy your country and not tell you about it. That means that, according to the law, it is legal for them to occupy a country secretly. They don't have to tell you. So first off, it doesn't have to be a military force. It could be all those other people I listed. Second, they don't have to tell anybody about it. They can occupy a country and have control over its assets and people without ever actually telling anyone. And they haven't violated the rules of occupation. Now this here says that, like, when a country occupies another, they should make it known. However, there's no specific legal requirement that the occupying power issue a proclamation of military occupation. They don't have to tell you anything. That blows my mind. Okay, now we're going to skip ahead to Article 11, Chapter 7. I hope that's the right terminology. I don't know what their naming convention is like. So let me just scroll down until I find 11.7, and we'll get back to some of this other stuff in a little while here. All right, 11.7 deals with the authority of occupying power over the inhabitants. Okay, check this out. It is the duty of the inhabitants to carry on their ordinary peaceful pursuits, to behave in an absolutely peaceful manner, to take no part whatsoever or whatever in the hostilities carried on, to refrain from all injurious acts toward the forces or in respect to their operations, and to render strict obedience to the orders of the occupant. You know what that means? That means that when one country occupies another country, the inhabitants of that country are required by law to render strict obedience to the orders of the occupant. That's mind-blowing. All right. Now let's move on to 11.8. Now this next part, oh my gosh, when I read this, I couldn't believe it. All right. I'm going to get back to that in a little while later. Let's see, 11.8. You know what? I'm going to get to that later, sorry. 11.8, 11.8. Where are we at? There we are. Okay. Where's my highlights? Here we go. Okay, have your mind blown. They are not subject to local law or to the jurisdiction of local civil or criminal courts of the occupied territory. That means that if a country occupies another country, law enforcement and military people of that country are not allowed to arrest them. Once they've established occupation, when they've taken that power or authority to enforce, their will, at that point, the inhabitants of the country are required to submit to them, and the law enforcement of that country is included in that. They're not subject to the local law. You can't arrest them. That's it. Once they've established firm control and they've established occupancy and they haven't violated the laws of occupancy, that's the situation they have. Now, you know what? I'm going to go back to 11.7 before I move on to the next section. Let's see. Okay, so 11.7, this part blew my mind. This part, sorry. Under the law of belligerent occupation for the purposes of security, an occupying power may establish censorship, regulation of any or all forms of media and entertainment, of correspondence, and of other means of communication. Now, does that sound familiar? Okay, well, that brings me to the point that I've been working towards making, and that is that, in my opinion, currently, I could change my mind later. I think Q has been trying to tell us that the United States has been under a hostile occupation for a really long time. And that's why we've been seeing some things like, how the government has they like, especially in recent years, like in the last decade or so, it's that whole rules for me but not for, or rules for thee but not for me thing, where they put rules on us that don't apply to them. Remember how Congress made themselves not subject to the rules of Obamacare and all that, and like the mask mandates that are currently in place, like they make everybody else do it, but then they're seen not keeping their own rules. We've seen tons of censorship on all forms of media recently. I suspect that is them simply exercising their force. And according to this law, they actually have a right to do that. And if we resist that, then we're actually breaking the law, and we're actually committing an act of insurrection. So, let's talk about the plan. Again, some of this is just me speculating. I suggest thinking for yourself. We've got all these Q drops where he mentions 11.3, 11.6, and there may not be. Yeah, here we go, 11.4. Some of them are kind of hard to understand, like this one here, for example. I'll do my best I'll take my best stab at it, and you can, agree or disagree. But I think what Q is trying to tell us in this post right here is that the indictment of Mr. Podesta is going to signify 11.3. So, real quick, let's talk about what 11.3 means, and then I'll get back to that. So I got to scroll back up now. Where are you, 11.3? All right. So 11.3 deals with how to determine when did an occupation end. So basically, the occupation ends when the occupant no longer factually governs. Like, in other words, remember how we defined occupation in the beginning was when they have force, when they actually have the ability to enforce their will on a territory, that's when they have occupied. When they lose their ability to enforce their will, the occupation is over. Okay? So let's read this part here. Belligerent occupation ends when the occupying power no longer has effectively placed the occupied territory under its control. Okay, that determines the end of an occupation. And what I'm suggesting to you here is that the indictment of Mr. Podesta is going to inform us that the occupation has ended. Now, what that means to me, or suggests to me, this may not be the right way of looking at it, but it suggests to me that Podesta might be like a top-level shot caller, and if he is taken out, then either it's only possible if the occupation has already ended, or the act itself will end the occupation. So I think it's one of the two. But either ways, when he's indicted, I believe the point is to let us know that signals the occupation is over. And so since the occupation is over, that means that the occupying force no longer has the rights outlined in the rules I've just been talking about. And it also means that we no longer have the requirements under those rules. So that means, the bad guys would lose their immunity to law enforcement. It means that they would lose their ability, or at least their right to govern us, their right to censor us. And it would give the power back to us when that happens. Now, keep in mind that concept that they have a right to censor us and control our information and communication. That might be why declassification has been so difficult, because remember, everything has to be done legally. So what if the reason a lot of things haven't been declassed is because of that desire to do everything according to the law? And according to the law, we're not allowed to really do that. That would be almost like insurrection. But what if once Podesta is indicted, and that signifies the end of the occupation, that's when the actual proof begins. So I don't know what your thoughts are, but so far, a lot of the stuff that's been declassified has been pretty underwhelming. I suspect that this has something to do with why that is. Now, also, 11.3 verifies as first marker. I suspect that it's sort of like the beginning of the actual war. Remember the whole shot heard round the world concept, that goes back to, in the war when the two armies were facing off against each other, but the fighting hadn't actually started, and nobody knew who's going to fire the first shot. And I don't think they know who fired the first shot, but somebody fired a shot, and that sparked the actual battle. Well, I suspect that is exactly what this is, that when the occupation ends, the actual battling begins. But the beautiful thing about this is that at the same time that the 11.3 marks the beginning of the actual battle, it also marks the end of the war. Basically, as soon as this happens, we should be virtually guaranteed that our side, they already won. Now, there's going to be battles, right? But, at this point, we have regained all of our power back, and the enemy has lost all of their power. And we will be, we would just significantly outpower them. They're going to be overpowered very quickly. But this is kind of like that crossroad. Okay, so let's see if there's anything else I meant to say about this. Oh, in this post, talks a little bit more about Mr. Podesta getting arrested. It says, "We have initiated certain fail-safes that shall safeguard the public from the primary fallout, which is slated to occur 11.3. What I think that means is, as soon as the occupation ends, the occupation is going to freak out, and they're going to start rioting and doing things like that. And that's what he's talking about by primary fallout. And of course, he's letting us know they've initiated certain fail-safes to protect as many of us as they can. Now, this next part's pretty interesting. It says, upon the arrest announcement of Mr. Podesta, actionable 11.4. So what I'm about to propose to you is that the arrest of Podesta signifies 11.3, but it's based upon 11.4. In other words, I think they're going to arrest Podesta for violating 11.4. Okay, but that is going to signify 11.3, the end of the occupation. So remember, what we're talking about here is actually the rules of war regarding occupation. So let's go look at 11.4. So I think this is the basis on which Podesta will be arrested. Did I skip that? Okay. Okay, so legal position of the occupying power. This is some of the requirements and so on. So here's the idea. The occupying power actually has the right to govern the enemy territory temporarily. So as long as they are holding the occupation, they actually have a legal right to govern. And some of their governing authority gives them some of the rights of sovereignty, but later on in this thing it explains, exactly where to draw those lines. And some of them are right here. And this describes the limitations on the occupancy, okay? Let's look at some of the limitations. The occupation is not authorized to make certain actions, such as annexing an occupied territory to create a new state. So let's just say hypothetically that we were under the occupation, like a secret occupation from China or something like that. What this is saying is that they could not legally make this or declare this to be Chinese territory. They could not say, hey, everybody, guess what? We've been occupying your country for a bunch of years now. Congratulations, the United States is now known as China Part 2. They can't do that. Otherwise, they'd be violating the rules of occupancy. In addition, they cannot compel the inhabitants of an occupied territory to become its nationals or otherwise to swear allegiance to it. Now, this part, again, my opinion, my interpretation, but I think this means two things. One is, if let's just say it was China that had occupied us, they could not require us to become Chinese citizens, and they could not require us to swear allegiance to China. But the other thing I think this means would apply more to the occupation itself. I don't think that they can compel us to become, like citizens of the occupation or swear allegiance to the occupation itself. I think that would violate this rule as well. Again, just my opinion. Take it with a grain of salt. Okay, but here's the other restriction. They do not have a right to alter institutions of government permanently or change the constitution of a country. This is what I suspect they're going to arrest Podesta for. Now, I don't think he's going to do it openly. Him doing this is probably not something we're going to see. What I suspect is that he is something like a shot caller or whatever, the equivalent of like a mob boss. And what I think is going to happen is he's going to go around and tell, the president, Biden, and various congressmen, maybe Supreme Court justices, and basically start giving them instructions to change the Constitution or to pack the Supreme Court or something of that nature that would alter our institutions of government permanently or change our Constitution. Now, as soon as he's done that, he's violated the laws of occupancy. And at that point, the military and law enforcement would no longer be obligated to submit. They could at that point legally step in, arrest him, do what they need to do, and they wouldn't be violating the laws of occupancy. Now, another thing that I also suspect is that he's actually already very, very guilty of having done this, and the military probably already has proof. And I suspect that they've been waiting just because of basically optics in the narrative. Like, they need the majority of the American public to accept this when it happens. And it's like, for a lot of people, it's going to be very difficult for them to believe that it's true to begin with. And imagine if it weren't for us, basically, if it weren't for the Q movement, I think the majority of people would just believe that what we experienced was a military coup and that the military just fabricated a bunch of like bizarre evidence against people that they wanted to remove from power. And it would cause people to have extreme distrust for the government and for the military. And so by doing it this way, they're not exactly controlling the narrative, but they're certainly influencing it. And when the storm hits, it's like Q said, you are the calm before and during the storm. I think that's going to be a big part of our role, is convincing people to chill out when it hits the fan. All right, now let's go back to stuff Q said. So I think that this 11.3 indicates, Podesta being indicted indicates that we're at 11.3, in other words, the end of the occupation. And I think that there's a little inconsistency in the wording here. I think Huma indicted on 11.6 is kind of like this, the actionable 11.4. I think what it's saying here is that her indictment is going to be on the basis of violating 11.6. And again, she's probably already done it. However, on a few occasions, I believe, Q has said, follow Huma. Now, I don't know exactly what he meant by that. He may have meant something to the effect of, watch what happens to her in the news and that sort of thing. But he also may have meant it very literally, like follow her on Twitter. Because I think she's probably going to violate 11.6 again. I think a lot of people on the left violate this one pretty routinely. So I don't think it'll be hard for the good guys to provoke her into doing it. So, one more thing. In this post here, this is 4635. It says that voter intimidation in national and local elections, and then of course in the little brackets it says coming 11.3. I think that is evidence that 11.6 has already been violated from the occupation. Try to remember that when I get to 11.6. Okay. Wherever it is here. All right. 11.6 has to do with protection of the population. So the population of an occupied territory, like other protected persons under the Geneva Convention, are entitled in all circumstances to respect for their persons, their honor, their family rights, their religious convictions and practices, and their manners and customs. They shall at all times be humanely treated, and shall be protected especially against all acts of violence or threats of violence, and against insults and public curiosity. So what I suspect is going to happen is that Huma is going to violate that. She's going to, I think most likely what's going to happen is public insults and calls for violence against people who vote a certain way. So remember this, voter intimidation in national and local elections. The reason 11.3 is coming as a result of that is because that is a violation of 11.6. So that's my theory on it. And I'd like to close with just something a little bit encouraging that I came up with the other day. Just something kind of occurred to me. It's a suspicion. And it has to do with a Star Trek movie. Many of you may have seen it. It's called The Search for Spock. Great movie. If you haven't seen it and you want to see it, you should be aware that I'm about to totally spoil the ending. So if you don't want to know how that movie ends, you should turn this off now, because I'm going to ruin it. And I'm not going to say anything else in relation to this, so you're not going to miss anything. Anyways, at the end of the movie, these Klingons, they attack the Enterprise. And at the time, the Enterprise has a really short crew. It's like 5 or 6 people. And they fire on it a few times, and they effectively completely cripple it. Like the Enterprise, they can't move, and they can't fire any of their weapons. They're just dead in the water. Now, the Klingons aren't really sure that that's the situation, but they think it is. And so they call them over their radio, and they demand immediate surrender and tell them, be prepared for us to board your ship. And so something pretty interesting happens. Basically, Captain Kirk surrenders. Now, he doesn't say those words, but he says, hey, okay, would you give me a few minutes to, communicate this to my crew? And so the Klingon captain agrees. So what Kirk actually does is he initiates the self-destruct sequence on the ship. And then he calls the Klingon captain and he says, all right, we're ready, go ahead and beam aboard. And while the Klingons beam aboard the Enterprise, the crew of the Enterprise beams aboard the Klingon ship. And a few moments after the Klingons board on the Enterprise explodes. And they all die. Well, I suspect that Trump has just done something very similar to that. I think he initiated some sort of a self-destruct sequence before he left office. And part of the reason I think that is, for one, the moral of the story in the Star Trek movie is that you should never trust the surrender of a master strategist. They typically don't surrender. A strategist will usually not give up hope until the very end, because they're always coming up with new strategies and stuff like that. So if you're dealing with somebody who's really good at strategy and they surrender, that should be a humongous red flag. Now, what did Trump do? I mean, yeah, he announced and told everybody repeatedly that the election was stolen and all that. But once January 6th happened, he kind of like all of a sudden was well-mannered. He's always been a real loudmouth. He's a loose cannon, and he has no problem insulting people in public and, basically calling them losers and things like that. And, after January 6th, he hasn't really done much of that. It's like he just kind of tucked his tail and walked away, which is extremely uncharacteristic for him. And I'd like to suggest that what's really happening, the reason he behaved that way was actually to lure them in. He wanted them to take over the administration. And I think it has something to do with these rules of occupation. I think that as soon as one of the bad players got into the top level of the office, all we have to do is wait for one of them to violate the rules of occupation, and then we will have the legal authority to get rid of them. I think that we've had the legal authority to get rid of them for a long time, but again, the nature of the plan had a lot to do with optics, to get the nation to accept it when it happens. But what will really help everybody to accept it is if they see the violations happen. Like we all see the censorship that's happening. We all see the rules that apply to us but not to them happening. And so I think at this point, the stage is set, so to speak. They've walked right into the trap, and it's only a matter of time till it happens. But what I think was going to happen, and they may not start with Podesta. He may not be the first arrest. It's just that when he's arrested, that'll indicate to us that the occupation's over. But they may have already started making arrests. I don't know, but I suspect he'll be the first, like the unsealed indictment. Remember that Q said would send shockwaves through the world? I suspect that might be that, but I'm really not sure. Anyway, hope you got something good out of that. Have a good one.